Welcome back. This time we have again the privilege of counting on Irina Tsukerman. She's with Scarab. Is what is the name?
Scarab Rising.
Yeah, Scarab Rising, and I would like to address with her some issues that have come to some new events that continue the conversation we had a couple of weeks ago. But first of all, I wanted to retake one issue of our first conversation. That is, we see. You remember the charts I sent you?
Yes.
Yeah, you see that the correlation after April 2, the correlation that has been that have been maintained between the treasuries, the 10 and 30-year treasury and the dollar index were broken.
Yes, correct.
That gap, that wedge has actually increased.
Mm-hmm.
And you see, for instance, to my astonishment today, I could learn that Donald Trump has threatened Brazil with tariffs of 50% if Brazil prosecutes Bolsonaro, his friend Bolsonaro. So this is kind of ridiculousness you could only find in banana republics or episodes of South Park. But it's not, not surprising from a president, coming from a president who threatened with tariffs Mattel and Apple as if they were countries, right? So how are the markets? Are the markets still complacent with Trump, as it seems, or are they already pricing the probability of some brusque adjustment?
Surprisingly, the shock has not been as bad as one might expect. And by the way, the issue is not with Brazil. The Brazil situation is a particularly stark example of weaponization of tariffs for entirely unrelated political reasons. But this is not the only example of Trump essentially ignoring the federal decisions that made these unilateral tariffs without congressional support unconstitutional. That issue, by the way, on a side note, is in the process of appeals in the courts. And hopefully will be finalized shortly. I don't think the Supreme Court will be looking at it personally. I don't think it will get there. I think the appeal will pretty much resolve this issue. But in the meantime, Trump is continuing to threaten a growing number of countries with very high tariffs. We have seen Japan and South Korea being hit with the 25 to 35% tariffs recently. He also went after a number of Middle Eastern and North African countries such as Iraq and Algeria and Tunisia, and basically telling them to open factories in the US. Now, I'm not entirely sure what factories he's hoping Algeria and Iraq would open, maybe date production, but I don't think this is an ideal climate for that. In most of the US, maybe in California, I don't know, or Libya was another one that was hit with a 30% tariff. He wanted Libya to open factories in the US. And then I have to say, there's a number of individuals of Libyan descent who have done quite well for themselves in assorted industries in the US, but they're out of the country. They don't live in Libya. Libya is a country with two governments, with assorted militias, and it doesn't produce all that much at the moment.
What brings me to two questions from what you have said. It's one, the first one is if I am Frederick Merz or Prime Minister Ishiba from Japan, and I hear this kind of declaration that seems coming from the Mad King in Game of Thrones, while the Democrats are secluded in the tower because they are still playing dead. what kind of expectations can I create? Because I only can see that the complacency of the markets continue as if this were not happening, and they have to prepare for a brusque adjustment. What implies in the case of the governments that they have to prepare for the worst case scenario in the case of the United States, and for businesses that they can have to postpone investments until the horizon is more clear, right?
Well, the thing is, tariffs are a thing that will have a very quick, relatively fast effect, and it's not going to be, once you start adjusting, it's not going to be easy to readjust back. That's the problem with these things, especially if you're talking about major goods, and with the Japan, we're talking about automotive industries, and things of that nature. So Japan initially tried to negotiate with the US, offered to buy more of US oil and gas, and which would be more expensive for it than procuring it from other places. But it offered to do so in exchange for not doing the tariff fiat. But that hasn't worked, and it got slapped with a very high tariff because Trump wants Japan to open factories in the US. Now, let's be clear. Japanese car companies are already working in the United States, and the US imposed tariffs on them anyway, because Trump, before he got into a fight with Elon Musk, wanted to protect Tesla specifically. And so he basically slapped tariffs on all cars, even those made in the US, if they had any foreign made components at all. So it doesn't pay for Japan to go along with the US on all these issues, economically speaking, because they get tariffed no matter what they do. If they open factories in the US, Trump will still likely tariff them because some components are going to be made elsewhere. This is how global supply chains work. US does not produce all these things that go into every major technology, even if it's compiled in the United States.
And now that you mentioned that, that's also the case of Mexico and Canada in the automobile industry. Do you know how is that industry adjusting to the new scenario?
Now, well, Mexico and Canada have been fighting back. The European Union and the automotive industry are now actually in the middle of talks with the United States. So that has not been fully resolved yet. And we will see what happens. They're trying to get exemptions. And so far, I think there's some room for maneuver with the EU. But overall, the automotive industry is already starting to feel the bite. And we can expect rising prices on assorted goods because all of that is going to get passed down to the consumer. And moreover, we can expect more supply chain disruptions because companies who want to avoid having to pay these tariffs are going to try to find ways of getting around the supply chain scenario, and that's going to take that's going to be difficult, that's going to be complicated because the US does not have the workforce to start producing all the components that are needed at home immediately. We just don't have that. So I'm not sure. I mean, if Trump is saying that this is his way of raising taxes, that's one thing. But he can't pretend that he can single-handedly restart an industry that has not been active in decades.
But for people to understand what we mean by dislocation of supply chains, what is currently right now happening in the automobile industry in Mexico and Canada? They are reducing production, working with whatever they have in stocks on supplies. What is the status of the manufacturing of automobiles?
There hasn't been the full impact of the tariffs quite yet, but I think they're looking to. I think I think we have seen some car companies already relocating out of the United States altogether. So I think what will make sense for Canada and especially Mexico is to actually move the production out of the US and completely avoid the US markets. I mean, it would be a big loss in the short term. In the long term, if they actually work closely and get into free trade agreement with the other markets like the European Union and China, that could be that could be a way out for them. China has been dumping EVs into the European markets, but China does not specialize in non-EV cars. So this is where Canada, Mexico, and others have an opportunity. And not everybody in China is going for EVs, even if their own EVs are much cheaper, and their own, non-EV vehicles are significantly subpar to what foreign markets have to offer. So if Mexico gets serious about autonomous car production, and if other companies decide to transfer their facilities to Mexico, first of all, it's going to be much cheaper because the labor costs in Mexico are much cheaper in the United States. Second, they can avoid the tariffs because Mexico is not going to tariff those companies. And third, they don't have to worry about what happens today because Trump has not been consistent in his policies. He's been changing his mind not only on tariffs in general, but on different industries. And every day we hear something new. Today it's the automotive, tomorrow it's copper, the other day it's steel, and then it's components or something else. So every day there are sectors that get affected. So you may not see the overall market collapse because not all of these tariffs affect everything. But if you follow specific industries or specific components, you will see price adjustments.
And that's where the silence of the Democratic Party is more infuriating, because if I am a businessman in Mexico or Canada, I need to see how long should I just make the painful adjustment right now and avoid American markets, or should I hold the line in case Democrats come back? But Democrats are silent, and if the Democrats are going to be the continuation of Joe Biden, well, they are just not that different. So that's why the silence of the Democratic Party is infuriating. But let me see. In the case of China, so Trump bragged about
I
getting.
just wanted to add a couple of more things
Sure,
regarding Canada
sure.
and Mexico. I
Mhm.
also wanted to add that Canada specifically imposed a matching tit for tat 25% tariffs on US auto
Mhm.
exports that didn't meet specific criteria, including US content that's embedded. And they Artworth also created a tariff remission framework which offers relief to manufacturers who are using American parts in production in Canada, such as for public health, food packaging, or processing. And they are also actually reviewing defense partnership and exploring alternatives to reduce US dependence. Now, what does defense have to do with automobiles? First of all, components. Second of all, automotive industries and defense can be linked, and third, it's actually a signal. It's a strategic signal because everything is related. If you want to have a relationship, it's not just going to be trade. It's going to be defense. It's going to be everything. So
That-
they are
I-
looking towards more European markets, especially, but of course, a lot depends on Europe as well. They're
are
definitely
you seeing signs of decoupling in the case of Canada and Mexico?
Well, for Canada, that process has started even before Trump officially imposed the tariffs. Actually, Canada's exports to the US have dropped since May 2024. That was even before it became clear that Trump was going to be elected, from 78 to 68%. And so Canada has already started expanding relationships with the EU, UK, Japan, and Indonesia. They're also working on a new free trade agreement with ASEAN group, with parallel collaborations on also digital economy, energy, AI, and food security. And there's also a Buy Canadian movement, which is basically a mirror image of America First economic nationalism, with app-driven guides helping consumers find locally made products, reducing travel to the US. Tourism has dropped, but not just tourism, also business travel has dropped significantly. So there's also rising popular discontent driving down demand for American goods. In Mexico, the situation is a little bit more complicated because Mexican economy is not, quite as strong. But so far, for now, as of this past month in June, Mexico auto industry has been 80% of its exports are still going to the US. It's going to take time for Mexico to adjust because they're that dependent on the US and they're not like Canada with a lot of wide ranging international relations. This is what made trade with Mexico so lucrative for the US. Very cheap supply chains, very integrated production, Mexico dependent on the US. It was a great deal for the US. Now it's becoming difficult because on the one hand, Mexico is getting tariffed. On the other hand, they can't easily just up and run. But already the exports are starting to decline in the first half of this year by 2.8%. So there's already vulnerability to this protectionist sentiment. It's not as big as with Canada because Mexico has few choices as of now, but it will probably be able to increase its options over time. And there are some exemptions. So under the current free trade framework that Trump himself has concluded in his first term, about 50% of Mexican and Canadian exports are actually exempt from tariffs. So they are facing the rest are facing duties, even especially on vehicles and their parts that are not compliant with the framework. Mexico has not actually imposed counter tariffs on cars and on steel, but it has pursued other responses, including production of staples like corn and oil to mitigate economic dependency on the US. So essentially, the long and the short of it, these countries that are being hit by tariffs are looking for other options and to become less dependent on the US.
Now, continue, please.
Which will actually be not so great for the US in the long term.
I know.
Sure, with some it will take much longer than with others. The more developed an economy, the more immediate options they will have. Poorer countries will be more dependent. They are also more likely to go to China. Wealthier countries are more likely to have more diverse options such as EU, UK, Japan, and and others. But it's still, but the ultimate, but it will have a hit on the U.S. economy down the line.
Oh yeah, we will end up unless Democrats man up, we will end up with a smaller and more expensive economy. Let me go to two issues. That is, first, those supposed the trade deals Trump has supposedly gotten because of his wisdom coming from the art of the deal. First is the China deal. That is not a deal, it's a truce. And then you have the case on which I would like to get your input, Vietnam. Vietnam 20% tariff. That seems just Vietnam caving in the short term while they adjust and then they can kick the table, right?
With China, it wasn't even the truth because what Trump announced was actually never implemented or signed. They actually resumed negotiations after that, and so far things are, they made some announcements in some areas, but the issue has not been fully resolved.
Yeah, that's why I say it's a truce. It's not a deal.
It's not, yeah, I wouldn't even call it a full truce because they didn't just freeze the situation pending the end of negotiations. It's still kind of a problem in many areas, and it's actually kind of hard to follow because Trump keeps changing his mind every other day. And also, it's not clear what actually is and isn't happening because he announces things that haven't actually been approved or implemented. Um, so you have to actually look at what the Chinese government states about these issues. You have to look at the actual, pricing in those particular areas and industries, and see what the U.S. Treasury and Commerce Department are actually doing.
Yeah,
Because
well,
if you just go, Mhm.
it seems the only clear things that got out of there is that, and that's why I call it a truth, is that Trump had to backpedal on the exports of high-tech exports to China, and China in return stopped the halt on
Sure.
rare earth. But that's all.
Yes, that particular aspect of it, I would say that, but I would say that Trump is caving in because Trump has not been able to get to the rare earths in other places as quickly as he thought, and the development in the U.S. will take years before it's anywhere near competitive level, and then breaking into the market is also not going to be easy because every year that U.S. is not developing fully developing its own rare earths is a year US is losing to China, and where China is making money off of that and dominating the market. So that is why Trump felt he had no choice but to backpedal. Now,
They,
I suspect he will cave in other areas, and we are already seeing signs of that because a congressional bill to restrict Chinese purchases of farmland in the US has already been met with Trump's comments that he has a great relationship with Xi and he will have to think about it. In other words, that bill may not be signed if it passes, Congress. So that could also extend to other trade aspects with China. I'm not sure what they would look like, but if Trump is tariffing Vietnam and other potential alternatives to China, he cannot simultaneously do both and expect to win this trade war in any meaningful way. Not that there's any real trade, winning, but to get any what he wants out of it. Let's put it this way, because he's simultaneously fighting with China and he's simultaneously alienating all the developing countries that could be providing him with alternatives. So he's raising prices across the board and making countries like Vietnam that were trying to disassociate themselves from China have to actually go back to China and actually strengthening China's economic network, which means all those countries in the long term could act as a block in reciprocal tariffs. Can Vietnam do it by itself? No, because its economy is so much smaller than the US. That's why it caved in so quickly.
and
But
that those economies, China and Vietnam, are very integrated. So
exactly. So that's why Vietnam was hoping to get more into a free trade deal with the US and more defense deals with the US. They were trying to kind of separate themselves from China and to diversify their economy through other partnerships. But with the 20% tariff, after they had already agreed to various concessions, including the Trump Tower, including the purchases of expensive US oil and gas at full price, mind you, that's not likely to happen. And what's likely to happen is that if Trump doesn't lift those tariffs, Vietnam is going to start doing more business with China again.
mhm. Or is that, or that they are consciously signing a deal because they don't have any other chance in the short term, and they just will start trying to decoupling to progressively decouple from the United States in order to avoid those tariffs, because 20% is very high
It
nowadays.
is. It is high, and what's even more ironic is that after Trump concluded this deal and said what a great deal he said, instead of 35 or 50% of whatever he was planning to do, he only did 20. He then sent out letters to various countries offering, basically giving them a 10% tariff, which was less than what he actually negotiated with Vietnam for all these concessions. So now Vietnam feels like they got a really bad deal, that Trump basically lied to them. And I suspect they may try to back out of this agreement very shortly. If they find an alternative with China or with somebody else, they may try to back out of this deal and essentially stop, reorient their business. Now, remember, the whole thing was to avoid getting cheap Chinese goods into the US. And Vietnam was one of those alternative sources. Now, let's imagine that both China and Vietnam are off the market, or their prices, the prices that the American consumers pay substantially increase. Now, Trump is saying buy American, but the American goods that are being produced now, not in the future, not in 10 years, but now, are already costlier than those things with tariffs, and nobody's going to. Opening a factory to produce goods locally costs money. You need to incentivize people to actually invest money in, and promise them that they'll actually make a profit, and then have to hire workers somewhere. Those workers can't be illegal immigrants, or because those people are being deported and nobody will sign up to go to a workplace where they can be arrested at any moment. So it would have to be someone in the US who has a legal permission to work. And we are looking at a very steep rise in prices over time. People are claiming that tariffs are not directly involved in inflation. Directly, no, but indirectly and over time, they absolutely will cause inflation if this continues. Because normally tariffs are not across the board with all countries. You tariff one industry or one country. You don't tariff everybody all at high percent. That's why most people don't see tariffs as being directly linked to inflation, but this is not what Trump's plan appears to be, functional speaking.
Basically, that's because the companies are still holding the oil on the oil prices because they overstocked in the first quarter, but that's not going to last forever.
Exactly. I think we're already at the point where they're starting to kick in. Unless you're Amazon, one of those really huge companies that has a huge stock for months in advance, that's I think we're basically at the point where it's already moving in that direction, and we probably in 2 months it's probably going to hit a lot harder than it's starting to already.
That brings me to the case of another weird tariff that is on pharmaceuticals that is going to affect India, from where much of generic medicines come. That is going. Let's remember that India and Brazil have been the counterpart inside of BRICS of Putin's anti-Western aspiration, and we keep pushing Modi into the arms of the radical, the Putin Xi side of BRICS, right?
It's actually a complete disaster for everybody involved. It's a disaster for the US because American-made pharmaceuticals are virtually unaffordable for many people, especially with the insurance-related adjustments that have gotten only worse over time. India offered significantly cheaper options of generic of things like antibiotics and assorted other meds that people can just buy over the counter or buy at a much cheaper price.
And
So
that no, please.
and by the way, the irony here is that Trump and RFK Jr. are always railing against big pharma, but guess who benefits from these tariffs? Big pharma, because this is protecting their interests. They can raise prices all they want, not
Exactly.
fearing
That's the
that
problem.
competition. So for all the talk about big pharma, all they're doing is banning vaccines and specific medicines that people need for their health, but they're not cutting down on profits. People will still have to buy whatever they can. They'll have to spend more on it, because if you're giving someone ill, they can't go on without antibiotics. They have to get it from somewhere.
And you have mentioned something that is very important, is also no surprise neglected by media. That is, companies with pricing power like Walmart, Amazon are going to be the ones in more that are going to be more in a better position to pass the cost of tariff to consumers, while smaller businesses are going to just have to absorb the most of the tariff. And that is going to be a process similar to what happened after COVID, where the participation of small businesses in employment fell dramatically because they didn't have the wide financial backs to stand the adjustment.
But have you thought that this may be part of Trump's strategy? Think about it. Some of the small businesses that were working with China or other countries taxed at high rate have already started being driven out of business. Many of them, by the way, Trump supporters or in Trump supporting states. It's a fact. This is not wishful thinking. You hear stories about it all over the place. I don't know how many businesses ultimately shut down, but the fact is, the last employment report labor report talked about shrinking job market, which means if job market is shrinking, it means businesses are shutting down and not offering places. Yes, you're also cutting down on federal positions, and universities are also cutting places, but I think at least some of these positions are in private small businesses that can no longer afford to resell goods from China or anywhere abroad, really. So I think Trump's strategy, if you look across the board, is to focus on a few big companies that he can have relationships with. We know that from everything he's done. Look at his trip to the Middle East. Who did he bring with himself? Did he bring a huge variety of assorted businesses? No. Did he bring any startups? No. He brought only a few companies that are huge and that are swallowing up any business there is. He did not diversify. He wants to hold these companies. He wants to have control and leverage of them. It's a protection racket. He wants a few people he can work with who are dependent on him and will give him what he wants. If the market becomes too diversified, if too many companies benefit from business with various players, he can no longer control them and he cannot dictate the rules of the game. So I think this is the reason why he wants fewer small businesses involved, why he wants big companies to benefit from this scenario.
And you see that the supposedly economic theory on which these trades are based are the Plaza Accord from 1986, that was consisted basically in forcing Japan and Germany to appreciate their currencies, which is what supposedly Trump is doing. But the matter is that if you see the numbers, the trend of manufacturing production didn't change in the 80s because of the Plaza Accord. The participation of manufacturing in GDP kept falling, and the participation of labor in manufacturing as a part of the all labor fell even more. So it's basically a fantasy. Yes, unless they cannot read a graphic, I agree. So this seems more crony capitalism even than protectionism, right?
Yeah, I would say I think it's a mixture. I think protectionism is being used as an excuse to gain support among certain sectors and segments and demographics, but crony capitalism, I think, is the real agenda here.
And we're getting back to the case of India, it's the other thing that Trump is not taking into account is that the smaller emerging economies are trying to negotiate by blocks, ASEAN, BRICS, and more people are going to more smaller countries are going to be attracted to this group, to these blocks, in order to not have to go through humiliating decisions like Vietnam and Mexico, right?
Well, yes, and besides that, there is already a trend separate and apart of Trump that started before Trump of middle powers becoming more active in international trade and defense and creating coalitions and strengthening those coalitions. And you have also countries like Russia and China creating their own blocks and offering alternatives and pushing for de-dollarization and trying to circumvent sanctions and essentially attracting corrupt actors and offering alternatives to the US. And you also have countries that create their own initiatives, not because they're ideological in nature or political nature, but for their own benefit. Like India has the unified payment interface. Which is being exported to Singapore, Nepal, and even UAE. It's allowing cross-border retail settlements without being part of the US-backed SWIFT system. India is not trying to bankrupt the US, but India is finding it more convenient for their own needs. And you can't exactly blame them for doing that. And it's also developing domestic alternatives to Western social media, to payment platforms. And you see in African countries like Nigeria, they're using also domestic digital currencies to expedite payments and not rely on the dollar so much, simply because it's fast, and not because they're all anti-US, but simply because it's just makes sense for them and for their needs as developing countries. So these processes are already ongoing regardless of Trump, and Trump is now exacerbating by pushing countries that don't really need to be part of it to get in on that.
What brings me to mind something a bit, I don't know if I can call it tragic or comical, all those headlines about saying that China wants to displace the dollar and be number one, as if this were the Fortune 400. Right? Chinese are not stupid, that stupid. What they, as you mentioned, from what I got from what you mentioned before, what they want is just to a zone where the yuan is the currency trade, and they can bypass SWIFT, right? That's all they want.
I don't think China seriously thinks that yuan will replace dollar completely anytime soon. First of all, it's too unstable and it's too speculative and nobody really trusts it. Second of all, US dollar is a convenient currency. The problem is Trump made it weaker, and I see the difference. I was traveling in Europe, and the course of the dollar was, against the euro at least, and the British pound was, not great. And Trump believes in weak dollar, but the problem is, his policies don't make sense. You want a big dollar when you want to people to travel abroad and purchase goods there. That makes no sense.
And his budget bill is precisely going in the opposite direction, in the direction of appreciating the dollar. So he's going he is going through two different contradictory directions.
Exactly. If you are so obsessed with deficit, why would you want a weak dollar?
Yeah, but that's why it's true. So, for instance, Krugman says they don't know what they are doing, but probably I agree more with you. They know what they are doing. What happens? They cannot be that stupid. Nobody can be that stupid. It's just that they want to use the economy to undermine rivals and create a system of crony capitalism like Orban in Hungary.
Look, people make money of speculating on currency. Essentially, this I see is a way, this manipulating dollar value creates opportunities for somebody. When the dollar is weak, who benefits? And for what purpose? And what are they purchasing with that money? Well, everybody's telling us, oh, that's not good. We should be, exporting US goods, not importing cheap goods from abroad. Right? That makes no sense.
And they use as I mentioned before, the Plaza Accord as precedent. they said, well, but manufacturing exports grew. Yeah, they grew in the short term, and the chart shows that. But manufacturing as a whole didn't change. The trend of manufacturing didn't change as a result. Actually, as a percentage of GDP, the manufacturing lost participation in the GDP. So the Plaza Accord didn't have because on top of that, they have Trump has in his budget bill has got it the Biden's industrial policy that was the one of the few things that made sense in the case of Biden's economic policies, right?
Well, if Trump was serious about expanding manufacturing, he would be creating incentives for more students to go into engineering that we badly need to expand our chip manufacturing and AI-backed goods, which is what we are good at and which is the growing sector of the economy. But he's not doing that.
And research and development. So the golden years of manufacturing, the 50s, the 60s, where research and development were about 2% of GDP. Now, if my memory doesn't betray me, it's just half of a 1%. That's not
Absolutely.
industrial policy.
No, not only that, but now he just basically destroyed the R&D in universities, costing hundreds of positions. So our university research is done. All these people are going to go abroad to China or Abu Dhabi or somewhere else, wealthier, maybe some wealthier European countries, Switzerland or someplace like that, Japan. And what are we going to be left with? Nobody, by the way, the people who support the expansion of blue collar manufacturing, not, are all the people who themselves are not going to go work there. They already have jobs, presumably. Their children are not going to go there because either they're they don't want to be working in manufacturing at all, or if they are, they're pursuing higher degrees and looking for to work for Elon Musk, not for a shoe factory, not a sweatshop from the 1970s. So,
yeah, that's exactly correct, and that's also what was mentioned. I follow Paul Krugman's columns, and that has also been mentioned by him. And that's why it irritates me even more with respect to the Democratic Party, because they are not selling an alternative narrative. And by the fact, it seems that in the mind of the people, if you want to bring jobs back, that's the cost of bringing jobs back. And that's not the cost, because that way you are not going to bring jobs back.
look, I mean, we might as well be looking for people to bring, I don't know, horse manure cleanup back. If you get rid of the of cars and bring back horses, it'll create the jobs for people to shovel horse manure. Does anyone want those jobs? No. Does anyone want to be riding horses? Also no.
but even more tragic than that, you see that the new jobs would require more education, jobs that are going to be in healthcare and in other areas, and yet you find that the records in high school, a significant part of American children end up in high school without decent skills at reading or understanding what they have read. So, and Donald Trump,
have the skills to actually be
and
doing
besides
those
that,
jobs.
Donald Trump has even cut Head Start. So he's undermining precisely the basis of productivity on the side of those workers who are dreaming that those golden blue collar jobs are going to go back, and they are going to transport them back to the 50s and 60s, and that's a fantasy. But the Democrats are not opening their mouths.
But let me put it this way: the Democrats are making the same mistakes as the Republicans, especially regarding the nature of education and the future of labor. They're still holding on to the idea of courting the quote unquote blue collar workers, but who is considered blue collar is going to change within 20 years as more jobs become automated. That doesn't mean there'll be fewer jobs. It means that they're just going to be different types of jobs. And people should be learning the skills now. Instead of discouraging students from using AI in their work, they should be teaching them how to use AI ethically in combination with critical thinking skills. tools so you can learn how to use prompts to elicit relevant information while also have the skill set to evaluate and analyze it and make sure that it's done correctly.
Yeah,
Instead of
but they are not opening their mouth or even to say something wrong.
But they don't. But that's because they themselves are part of the problem. Because the Democrats are as backwards on this issue as the Republicans in every way. They still are obsessing with this philosophy of unionized labor, which, by the way, is heading. And this unionized labor, at least in the form that everybody's used to, is not going to make it in the age of AI. It's just not going to happen.
And the transition is going to be very, very painful. And
It doesn't have to be. It
it
doesn't have
doesn't
to
have
be,
to
but
be,
they are
but it's going
making
to
it
be.
painful.
It's
It
going
is
to
going to
be.
be in the US because they are
It's,
not adjusting and they're not preparing people to adjust, and they're selling people false hopes about the future. If the US doesn't,
especially if you mix artificial intelligence with automation, because then even blue collar jobs are at risk, and considering that Donald Trump has depleted the power of fiscal policy, because new relief would have to come from more expensive debt, and that the effect of the Federal Reserve on interest rates is going to be very diminished, because in such a scenario, the Federal Reserve could cut the interest rate all they want, and it's going to have a very slim, tiny effect.
yeah. I mean, I almost feel like it's almost irrelevant what is to Trump and to all these policymakers. I don't think they actually care what's actually going to happen. I think all it is basically vying for votes from people who do not understand the economic and labor impact of the current policies and where the things are going, and they're just trying to get very short-term political support so they could get what they need out of the system before retiring to live in the Bahamas or whatever, wherever they end up going after they finish their term.
And before I jump to the head, that my question is, well, if not the Democratic Party, who is responsible for helping people connect the dots and not be misguided by Trump fantasies?
Well, it's not the current set of analysts that I'm seeing, because I'm seeing an extremely polarized overall advocacy for this or that that's very partisan and tied to completely fallacious reasoning on both sides of the political aisle. I do not see experts with degrees in supply
Politicians in the
chains or.
political field. The
Mhm.
political field, the closest we have gotten to that is Andrew Yang proposing the basic minimum income. And beyond that, silence about the
I don't see
transition.
any creative thinking at all about any of the current issues. I just think I see a lot of either fear mongering or completely idealized thinking with that's very far removed from the processes ongoing. It reminds me of the underwear gnomes meme. We are going to you have gnomes who are planning to steal underwear. We are going to
I,
yeah,
yeah, so far.
yes,
South Park, yeah, I remember. And the point in the middle was in the interrogation sign, because they didn't know how to connect with the one from with the other.
exactly.
Yeah,
Hmm.
that's the same. And unfortunately, as you say, the Democratic Party, which should be the alternative, is part of the problem. Now let me say, let me see. Tell me if I am wrong when I get this conclusion. The European Union approved 800 billion euros for defense, and they
Hmm.
earmarked that amount.
Hmm.
Trump saw an opportunity to sell American weapons, because so far, so so he pushed for 5%, 3% plus 1.5% in the near future of increasing participation of defense in GDP. That could not be absorbed, obviously, by Europe in the current conditions. So that means that they are doing what they are starting, even Germany are starting to use that money to buy more American weapons instead of adjusting the fragmented, inefficient European defense industry. So I am growing my so that in my appreciation that Trump has seen this opportunity as a a small town fair merchant instead of pushing for clear guidelines that lead to long term contracts.
Yes and no. I mean, Trump is now trying to retake, the uh, return some of the countries that he lost as a result of the tariffs and generally anti-European position of his administration. You saw J.D. Vance the other day pushing for the return to US-based defense manufacturing. But the problem is US actually lost hundreds of billions of dollars in contracts already in a very short period of time. That's a lot. People don't see it. The truth is, of course, there are some types of defense systems that only US can produce, and those systems are not going to go anywhere. Europeans are stuck buying them because US has a monopoly on them. But anything that US does not have a monopoly on, they will try to find an alternative to, including domestic internal products. Of course, France has its own entirely separate defense system, with the exception of one joint co-development project with the UK. So France is trying to position itself as an alternative to the US. A lot of the European projects are actually co-developed with the United States, but here is where middle powers like Brazil, Turkey, and South Korea are going to come up, benefit from this. They're all each specializing in different things. Turkey is big on drones. Now, some of those drones are being re-examined because Ukraine has largely reinvented the conflict in terms of a different strategy, not huge types of Bayraktars, but smaller swarms of drones. But on the other hand, in some conflicts, like between Pakistan and India, the Bayraktars still performed, quite well. So Turkey is going to be a big beneficiary of that. Brazil is developing small arms manufacturing. That's a fraction of the cost of the United States. South Korea is really becoming quite big on that market as well. So I think a lot of these things, yes, European Union has a big problem with their internal issues. Many of the countries can't or do not want to raise the budget for defense. Even if they do raise the budget, capacity building still takes time. Plus, there are other issues such as speed of implementation of particular projects, such as cooperation and state secrets and trade secrets and security issues and information sharing. All of these things are problems when you have a block of 27 countries plus the United Kingdom plus several other countries that are not strictly speaking, EU, but they're European or NATO allies or whatever. So there's a lot of different issues. But the problem is, Trump has given Europe an incentive to unite about around one thing, being less dependent on the United States. So they may not do it.
And yet, I see cases, for instance, Europe still doesn't have a visible, clear path to consolidation or at least regional specialization. They are still affected by bottlenecks like explosives. They still don't have explosives produced in Europe. They appeal to the production of allies. So you see, it's as if after all the optimism that came after the election of Merz of Chancellor, Europe have decided to go back to devolve to what Europe is normally do. They create big funds like the New Generation Fund, and then they end up wasting them. Because if there are two conditions, one is the consolidation of Europe, of the defense industry. Because, for instance, you need for fiber optic drones, you need the kind of investment that neither Brazil or North Korea or South Korea is going to be able to make. That should be probably Germany. But so is fiber optics kind. There are issues, electronic warfare. There are issues that require the kinds of investment smaller countries in the European, in NATO even, are not going to be able to make. Second is that I am convinced that if Ukraine fell, with that, the upgrade, the overhaul of the European defense industry is going to fall with Ukraine for two reasons, basically. Number one is that Ukraine has about 1 million army strong of seasoned soldiers. And Europe is very reluctant to deploy soldiers. I don't know if you learned what happened with the 155 and 157 brigades trained by the French. That
They ended quite badly.
it was terrible. It was embarrassing. And why? Because the Ukrainians were not properly supplied. They couldn't rotate seasoned soldiers and integrated. And that's not who could have known. Who could have known? No. It's Jack Watling have in numerous articles have said that precisely that's what you need: training at the company at brigade level, integrating those soldiers. But that's impossible unless you supply properly with artillery, supply Zelensky properly with artillery, because otherwise those soldiers are going to be stuck at the front. And the number two reason is that the Ukraine has proven a reliable lab to see what they work and what doesn't work. For instance, in drone warfare, and even in the case of courts, they taught the experience taught us a lot about the use of fiber optic drones. So if you lose Ukraine, I am convinced that also $800 billion are going to be wasted. Right?
Yeah, I mean, look, Trump obviously wants all these countries to spend the money on US systems. And it's true that some systems are only made in the US, and Germany doesn't, it's easier for Germany to buy Israeli or American systems that it's used to than to invest in risky projects that it's not unclear whether they will succeed. That said, of course, just because Trump said that he wants Europeans to buy American doesn't actually mean that they're going to listen to him. I mean, yes, where they cannot produce something or where they cannot find alternatives or where it's just easier to buy American, that's what they will do, at least for now. And yes, it's a problem that Germany is not realigning as quickly as it was expected, but I'm not sure what people expected Merz to do in 6 months that they haven't done in 10 or 20 years.
So, but what I would expect is clear guidelines on which I can base long-term contracts. Who is going to be in charge of what? And there, I have read a couple of articles. For instance, Germany has more potential in what requires more investment in research and development. There are other more smaller countries that could specialize in artillery and that need to develop, for instance, their own TNT explosives production. And you could articulate, specialize, consolidate, or specialize by regions the production in order to be able to, in a decade, progressively reach the goals. And in the short term, you would have to rely precisely in the production of cheaper drones and artillery to supply Ukraine. But at least you have a plan where you are efficient in the long term, the decade, and effective in the short term to supply Ukraine.
But here's another issue. The $100 billion for defense, this is just a generic blob of money. It's not specifically delineated for anything it hasn't been prioritized. So you have things like the European Defense Fund and PESCO, which is Permanent Structured Cooperation. Those programs exist, but they are themselves underfunded, they're fragmented, and they're politically fragile. So yeah, you have two separate issues. You have a bunch of money that needs to be allocated for R&D and for purchasing weapons and for figuring out what can be a good substitute for the US weapon on the one hand. And then you have to actually effectively create or strengthen the programs that exist and allocate the money to them and make sure that it actually works. So those are two separate problems and they are connected to some extent, but they're not being handled. And US is not going to help Europe with the issue of those programs. It's not US job, first of all. It's a direct conflict to US interests. So but I also don't necessarily see the fact is US is still losing money because where Europeans don't have to buy American, they don't. They go to other places. So yes, US still has a major advantage and Trump can still use this opportunity to try to continue this European dependency on US manufacturing. And until Europe resolves that problem with actually creating effective programs that work and figuring out how to prioritize their development of weapons, and they're kind of stuck.
But you see that is depressing. For instance, those guidelines are not, you don't have long-term contracts because you don't have those guidelines for consolidation. You don't have the people preparing to be the engineers that are going to be in charge of the production process in defense because there are no contracts. So we, one way or the other, we go back to the basic guidelines for consolidation on which you can plan your workforce, your long-term contracts, your supplies, your
Look,
investment.
I'm not sure if you were following the story about the French-German project that resulted in a complete mess. The
No,
reason,
please.
yeah, there was a project. Let me just get you the specific name for it, because I forgot. Um. So, I'm talking about the fighter jet FCAS. So that has resulted in the fact that they are having a huge conflict because Paris is demanding an 80% work share in the production of this Franco-German jet. Needless to say, the Germans are not happy with that. So this is one
Example.
airplane, one small thing. This is not an overarching cooperation agreement. This is not a long-term product. This is one co-production of one piece of machinery that they can't even agree on.
Well, then they are accomplices. And it's my perception, probably because I have lost lots of the optimism I got after Mercer's election, is that it's at first Europe seems to be willing to take Mercer's lead, but right now it's as if they were avoiding the issue. Everybody going their own way, just meeting on the Hague for just protocolar effects, but without real
They
clear
still
goals.
don't think that they have to. That's the reason. Because bureaucrats will try to get away with doing as little as possible for as long as they can. That's my personal rule of bureaucracy number one. And for so long as they feel that US is still part of NATO, it's making demands, but it hasn't gone anywhere. Its technology is there to be bought. Trump wants them to buy it. So what's the problem, right? So they don't feel the dire need. They feel that US at the end of the day still wants to make money. That's why it's not going to go anywhere despite all the comments. Okay, it's not helping Ukraine, but it's also not selling things to them. So they don't feel the real incentive to hurry up. Not a real one, not a dire one. And no one's demanding them. The Russian forces are not there in France and Germany. Okay, the bottom line is the nature of the threat is not defined by anyone in the EU. They're talking about Russia and even China, but they're not defining the threat. What exactly are they afraid of or should be afraid of and need to be prepared for? Nobody's saying. Everybody's having very different perceptions of what is the big emergency they're supposed to prepare for. Unless you define your agenda and goal, you are never going to have a strategy to get there.
And that's precisely what I was trying to address in some of the questions I sent you via email,
Mhm.
because there is no sense of urgency, even though there you can make
There
clear
is a sense
parallel.
of undefined urgency, but undefined urgency is almost, it doesn't create anything except for just highly ineffective panic and a lot of talk.
Let me put you just this parallel that should be very telling. Uh, Putin's economy right now is going through a similar path to Hitler's economy after 1936, addicted to war. So they cannot afford the luxury of adjusting the economy to peace. So that they are going to continue getting into adventures, military adventures, especially if China gets more compelled to support Russia because it's cornered by the West instead of instead of being pulled in a different direction. And the case of Afghanistan is very telling, because you see in Afghanistan so after the fall of after the withdrawal of the Americans from Afghanistan, the Chinese show a lot of interest in the Afghan lithium, but didn't there because the ISIS-K was there. And yeah, now they replicating as what they have done with first with Wagner and now with Africa Corps in the Sahel. The Russians are getting into Afghanistan to secure peace for their oil pipeline, and at the same time to provide security to Chinese investment in lithium in China. So a privateer standard, and that's why Europe should try to understand that is not this is not just a matter of a territorial demand that Russia wants to get 20% of Ukraine and then all is going to be peace. No, they want the 100%. And probably that they are not going to use war. We are going to talk a bit more about the hybrid war on Sunday, but they are going to try to export the Georgian model and destabilize Moldova after Ukraine and on other countries in Europe, right?
Here's the problem with all of the European countries. In my opinion, it's very simple to assess the level of threat. You just wargame it. You put in all the inputs for all the likely scenarios. You put in the level, Russian economy, Chinese economy, who is helping them. Will Iran help them with what weapons? Will North Korea help them? Will Islamist movements help them? Non-state actors, what non-state actors? You put all of this calculation into one huge thing, and you war game scenarios. How likely is that they're going to attack Estonia? Highly likely, because Estonia is not protected from all sides. How likely they're to attack Lithuania or Latvia? This is the likelihood compared to Estonia. How likely are they to attack Finland or Poland? You put in the calculation. What happens once they, if they get entrenched in Russia? What is the likelihood of asymmetrical warfare attacks on the territory of Poland, Romania, so on and so on? You create all these scenarios, you create like 20, 30, 50 of them. You war game it, you analyze them based on the probability of the likelihood of what Russia is actually likely to do based on their current, uh, current trajectory, current resources, current alliances, and the general direction of everything is going. And then you figure out what you need for each of those scenarios, and you quantify that. And you obviously put in a little extra because not everything is 100% predictable. People are human beings, and they won't always act rationally or the way you expect them to. But generally, in terms of military scenarios, there is a limited number of options with some small variations here and there that is not that difficult to predict, because there are only a certain variety of geopolitical physical actions. If you're talking about full-scale invasion versus cyber attacks and terrorist attacks and things like that. So you figure out the likelihood of economic damage in each scenario, how much it's going to cost to repair, what it would cost to respond in what ways, versus what happens if you don't respond. All of these things you can calculate, and it would probably take less than a day for a machine with a skilled worker or a few to do that. What I don't understand is why none of this has been done by someone outside the political class and leaked into the public to spark that debate in earnest.
And that reminds me, honestly, I am more concerned about the Russian Africa Corps expansion in Africa because of the issue of resources like minerals and rare earth than in Estonia.
And that too can be wargamed in exactly the same way
And
and
now,
calculated.
tying it to your answer, you can
Mhm.
see the embarrassing moment event in which Pistorius is fighting inside the SPD, his own party, the back Scholz wing, the Olaf Scholz wing, that is still is trying to appease Russia. Even though the SPD is already part of Merkel's coalition, that's very discouraging. And yeah, is that they have not run those models, or is that they don't want to run those models, or they just are very complacent assigning probabilities? So but whatever the case, the matter is that is very discouraging, right?
But listen, I'm not, of course, governments have their agendas and interests, and they may have their reasons for not running it. But are you telling me that there is not one company, not one private actor, not one university, not one think tank, not one individual scholar in all of Europe seriously concerned about those issues who cannot do something of that nature and then publish it privately without having to wait for the governments to do that?
Well, they are repeating.
I find that very surprising. Yeah, the governments lie, the governments cover up, the governments take their time, the governments, find excuses. But there's no shortage of interested and concerned parties, ranging from defense industry manufacturers to cyber experts to economists and others who are directly impacted by what happens next, that have an interest in getting that sort of information out. Why
And
have
yes,
we not done that?
it's very astonishing that they are repeating the history in the case of Czechoslovakia in 1938,
Mhm.
and
But
they are
in that case, they didn't have AI and they didn't have that complex machinery of calculating scenarios.
they didn't have many things.
Yeah.
Now they have the advantage of having the hindsight of that experience.
Mhm.
They still are closing their eyes like the dog that closes their eyes, expecting that nobody is going to see them because they cannot see the other. But let me give you the last 4 minutes I have to give the last word before we meet again on Sunday. Please, on what other issues do you about the issues we have been talking about today? What aspect do you think needs to be addressed a bit more?
I have to say, we've talked about a lot of very problematic scenarios with corrupt or inept government officials creating unnecessary problems or refusing to solve problems that are solvable. But the difference between my outlook and everybody else's outlook on this is where everyone sees the problem in Donald Trump, the Democrats, the Europeans, and everybody else who are not doing their job or who are doing the wrong job. I'm seeing an opportunity for everybody else who is critical of all these decision makers to come up with solutions and to start actually practically promoting them. Because right now, I'm not seeing that from the private sector. I'm not seeing it from anybody. All I'm seeing is more, partisan excuses for everybody else who's already not doing anything for why they're not doing it. But the people who are seriously critical, who want answers, they can create conditions to create public demand for something different and alternative. And this is what I think should be, in democracies, we're not in a monarchy, we're not living in China and Russia. We can create the demand by educating the public and telling them what questions they should be asking of their government officials instead of just listening to propaganda from either the government, the opposition's parties, or from assorted foreign algorithms, on social media. What are the questions every person concerned about the future should be asking, and what kind of answers are they entitled to? You want a vibrant democracy that's prepared for serious problems. This is what the focus should be right now. Forget Trump, he's never going to change. Forget European bureaucrats, they won't move unless there's a dire need, and their neck is on the line. So create that emergency in the public view, in the public mind.
So we're on the same page. That's why I send you that small Substack article, and please help me to share it, because the idea is not to show that I am a visionary or anything. It's just a first input in a kind of open source software aimed at bringing visibility on those questions we have been addressing and that the media normally neglects. And that's why precisely those politicians in Brussels and other places can get away with just ignoring and wasting funds and so on. So, as always, it has been great to having a conversation with you. Let me say it on the record, you are the best expert I have the honor to talk to. And we may not agree 100%, but at 95% we are. And we are on the same page.
More than agreement, I think it's worth having a conversation that forces people to think. If everybody agreed on everything, there wouldn't be anything to do. The issue is not the agreement. The issue is the process of thinking and evaluating problem and actually trying to get to a solution in whatever way, rather than being complacent or ignoring and being so mired in looking for differences or for perfection or for perfect alignment that you end up getting stuck and doing nothing at all.
Well, the clock is cruel, so we'll meet again on Sunday, and thank you for now. See you on Sunday.
Thank you so much. See you then.
Okay.